Hello, my name is Roisin, and since we are just over 6 months through the year, I'm going to talk to you about my 10 favourite books of the year so far. I'm pretty stingy with my 5 stars, so these aren't all 5-star books. I actually don't really give star ratings at all in reviews, but I do give them over on Storygraph, just so I have kind of a ballpark idea of what I think of books when it comes to looking back over my year. I don't think they're particularly helpful when it comes to reviews though. I prefer to try and articulate that by talking about them rather than just by giving a star rating. Only 3 of the books on this list are books that I would consider to be 5-star books, like books that I really loved. The others I really liked, but I don't think were perfect books, but they are my 10 favourite books that I have read so far. Let us begin. The one on the bottom here is Middlemarch by George Elliot, which is a book I had been meaning to read for years. George Elliot is a very famous Victorian writer. Middlemarch is perhaps her most famous book, and it follows 3 couples in the early 19th century in a small town. We follow kind of their relationships throughout the course of the years. It is kind of a long saga, I would say. What I really enjoyed about it is the way that it explores that particular time period. It's kind of historical fiction because George Eliot was writing later on in the Victorian period, and this is set in the Georgian period, a period of great turmoil in terms of industrial revolution and the Corn Laws, various changes, people becoming the rising of the middle classes and the people moving to be more less rural and more urban. That's the word I want. Whilst this book doesn't really have a particular direction or a particular plot that you can really focus on, it is focused in on the ways that this small town watches one another, the kind of political machinations of a small town, which I think can be quite interesting. There is a large cast of characters and there is quite a lot of humour in that. It is also exploring the religious ideas and the changing way that people were viewing the world through this time period. There was a lot of wit to it, quite a lot of humour as well, and I enjoyed that. It isn't my favourite Victorian book or my favourite classic, but it definitely was one that I was glad to finally have gotten around to, and one that I really appreciated having spent a decent amount of time with. I've been reading a lot more big books this year, as you may know if you have been following my big book club, and I think I have been enjoying sort of getting immersed in a big book and a world, and I enjoyed the way that George Eliot does the Victorian thing of talking about ideas and philosophy and kind of almost enmeshing the ideas about the world that they want to discuss interspersed throughout the vignettes with these characters. I think the way that she did it was light enough and with enough humour compared to the way that it is done in some other Victorian novels. A very short book and a much newer book is Mona by Pola Oloixarac, which is the story of a Peruvian writer who is going to a literary event in Iceland? No, in Scandinavia somewhere, but there is an Icelandic author who comes as well. So I read this when I was in Peru. If you want to go and watch the vlogs of me being in Peru, I will leave that in the cards above. This is a very strange little book. Our main character, Mona, she has experienced a trauma, and there is a lot about her memory loss and about what has been happening, the things she is trying to avoid back home, and then she travels to this literary event, and there are different characters from different parts of the world. They kind of represent a stereotype of people who write from that geographical place, the expectations, the literary expectations of writing from a place, and she talks about the expectations of magical realism when you're a writer from Latin America, and also the idea of putting your trauma on the page and your trauma being drawn upon, and that's how you get literary success, is by opening yourself that much. It is a strange book, a really weird book. There are men following people around all the time. It reminded me of the director of The Lobster. His kind of style, I feel like, would fit with this kind of book. It does go to strange places and to very dark places, and it is kind of a bleak comedy, I would say, but I think it did find it very evocative, and it is one that has really stuck with me because the ending didn't quite hold together for me. That was the reason it isn't a 5-star book. When I first finished it, that ending had made me think lesser of it, but now going back in my mind, it definitely stuck around, and it is one that I think I would like to reread and to reconsider from a different perspective, looking at it more satirically and less straightforwardly. I read the International Booker Prize shortlist this year, and I will leave that link to the cards above if you want to see my vlog of that, and 2 of those books have made it onto my list. The first one I want to talk about is Stillborn by Guadalupe Nettle. This is set in Mexico. Guadalupe Nettle is a Mexican author, and is set in Mexico City about 2 women who decide in their 20s that they never want to have children, and now in their 30s our main character breaks up with her partner because of that, because she doesn't want to have any children, but her best friend decides she does want to have a child. Our main character is dealing with her relationship with her mother and also her relationship with her friend now that her friend has become, has changed her mind about this situation. But on top of that, her friend, when she does become pregnant, discovers that her child is told that her child probably will not survive for very long once she's born, and so she has to make a decision about whether to carry on the pregnancy and also about afterwards and what is going to happen for them. And so it is about motherhood and the changing roles of motherhood and the unexpected, the ways that you can never be fully prepared for it. It is also about like friendship and the expectations of care and the expectations of friendship once people have gone in different directions, and the ways that things can be all consuming. I was a little unsure about the way that disability was used in this book, but I really I wasn't definitely against it. It was just something I was considering the use of it, but I do think that it was a powerful book for being such a quiet, still book with very strict pared back writing, at least in terms of the English translation. And I thought it is another one that's really stuck in my head, which I think is one of the reasons that I put it on this list. One that was on the Women's Prize for Fiction shortlist is Trespasses by Louise, and this is the only book that has made me cry so far this year, which is why it's made its way onto this list. This book is set in a small town on the edge of Belfast in the early 1970s, so the height of the Troubles. This town is supposed to be integrated, but there is still huge amounts of tension and violence between the 2 communities. Our main character is called Kushla, and she is a teacher in a Catholic school who starts to have a relationship with a much older married Protestant barrister. So whilst that is the central narrative, we do also follow a lot of other different subplots and of different characters, including a Catholic family living in a Protestant estate, and the children that our main character teaches, her brother and his wife and their relationship, the difficult relationship with her mother, who is an alcoholic, the relative class status as well of our main character and her, the person she is having an affair with when she interacts with his Protestant rich friends, his intellectual friends, and their snobbishness towards Catholics, their assumption of them almost as uncultured, their extreme prejudice towards Catholics, their sexism, and all of the different ways those things intersect. It is not a very complex story in terms of what actually happens, and I think if you have any idea of the Troubles, it could maybe be considered to be predictable. But what I think was really powerful about it was it as a character study, and the way that all of the characters and also the time period were completely solid. They all felt very, very real, were allowed to be complex and difficult. I heard someone call Kushla an unlikable character, and I don't think that that's quite an accurate descriptor. I guess maybe some people didn't like her, but what she is a flawed character and an immoral character, but for me that doesn't equal the same thing as unlikable. She does things that are not morally correct, but she herself is not a terrible person or offensive in any way. She is quite a warm, likeable, interesting character. But yes, as I said, it is a book that made me cry. Particularly, there is just this wee boy in Kushla's class, and his storyline is what really set me off. But I think it was a wonderful book, and I'm really glad I read it. One I read for my big book club, as I mentioned earlier, was The Makioka Sisters by Junichiro Tanizaki, which was the first book that we read for the big book club, and I read that with Matthew Sharappa. You can watch the live show up here if you would like to check it out. The Makioka Sisters is a modern classic from Japan. It was written in the 1950s about these 4 sisters living in Japan on the eve of the Second World War, during the Sino-Japanese War actually. The elder 2 sisters are married. The 3rd sister needs to become married before the 4th sister can get married, because they're in a very traditional conservative family in a very traditional conservative country. And it just follows the lives of these 4 sisters and the kind of disasters they get into, health-related disasters, disasters, natural disasters, there are floods, there is all sorts of kind of melodrama that happens, but it all happens in a very small scale between these sisters, and they are all unlikable characters, definitely. They're all very stubborn characters who believe things should go their way, and it is very fun, enjoyable, I found, to watch the ways that they rub up against one another, and their stubbornness and their need for control. But it is also an interesting look at Japan in that time period, particularly the changing in the time period. Some of the sisters and some of the other characters are a lot more modern than some of the older sisters, who are a lot more traditional, even insofar as the way they dress. It also has a kind of feeling of melancholy, and there is a kind of hanging over of the story of the future of Japan, I feel like. There is a kind of melancholy of the change of the ways of the world, almost like Forster, I would say. It was definitely one that I enjoyed more, even after having had the discussion. It also has some like really beautiful writing about nature and scenes, and there's a lot of like cyclical stuff, scenes of cherry blossoms and fireflies and stuff that is really, really lovely, particularly the translation. The other book from the International Booker shortlist that made my that has made my top 10 books of the year is Time Shelter by Georgi Gospodinov. This is a Bulgarian book. This is a book translated from the Bulgarian, and it is a kind of, it's really an interesting book because it is definitely, it's not a plot book, it's not a character book, it's an ideas book, and I do find myself enjoying those a lot recently. So this is about a man who meets another man who he may have invented, this other man who is a psychiatrist, and he starts to have this idea of treating Alzheimer's patients by creating rooms that are perfect replicas of an earlier time period, and even down to the light in the rooms. And so he has this house where he turns different rooms into different eras. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, there is a dividing wall between the two sides of the house, where one is Eastern Bloc countries and one is Western Bloc countries. And then it begins to extend out, and it becomes political ideas about countries deciding that they want to go back to a specific time period, and all the countries in the EU have a vote as to which time period they want to go back to. It does talk about all the different countries, but it is specifically focused in Bulgaria and talking about Bulgarian history and what Bulgaria was like during the Cold War, but also the use of nationalism and nostalgia in Bulgarian politics today. And it looks at that idea of political nostalgia and making a country great again, and what it means to look back, and has all these reenactors doing things. It's a really surreal, weird book, but it's really interesting. And then the final third goes back into like personal ideas of memory and of writers and memory, so it has kind of that meta idea, but it is about his memory and how that weaves into his books, and why he never names his characters because he can never remember the names. And I did find it really interesting, really well written. It's very readable despite being an esoteric book, but it is also very funny. It has like a lot of humour to it, and it is very propulsive as well. It was one that I found myself moving through quite quickly. The one thing that distracted it from me is that when it went into that political book, there was very clearly a political perspective that did feel very centrist dad, which I was a bit eye-rolly about, but I think it still was an interesting book and an interesting exploration of ideas. I read The Giant O'Brien this year, which is by Hilary Mantel, who is one of my favourite writers, and this is one of her novellas that I haven't heard as many people talking about, but it is one that I really, really loved. This is set in the 18th century, and Hilary Mantel, of course, is a master of historical fiction. It is about a very tall man from Ireland. He's a giant, and he and his kind of troupe of friends decide they're going to come to London to make their fortune. It talks about the poverty in Ireland at the time and the treatment of the Irish under colonial rule, the segregation of the people and the extreme poverty. And so they come to London to make their fortune, and at the same time there is a Scottish physician who becomes obsessed with getting the body of this giant. He is kind of obsessed with bodies in general and with doing experiments, live experiments on people, particularly working class people, but he just becomes obsessed with procuring this body. He wants to own this body, and it is a very short book, but so beautifully written. It is a very like dreamlike book in a lot of the reading, particularly when we're reading from the giant's perspective rather than the physician. He is a storyteller. All giants in Ireland are storytellers, and it weaves in elements of sort of folklore and folk beliefs that were still very prevalent in Ireland at the time, beliefs about the gentlefolk, the little people. And there is a lot of humour in our characters, this troupe of characters who come to London and have never seen a to story building before. Because they come from a place where magic is real, there is a belief that there could be magic here too. It is also a very violent book, and a book that deals a lot with class and with the Irish as immigrants in England at the time, and living in like very squalid quarters, and their treatment at the hands of the English. It does a lot for a very short book, and of course it is so evocative of the time period, which is one of the things I love most about Mantel. My friend Sarah wrote a book that came out in January, and that is Rebel Bodies. She's called Sarah Graham. She is a journalist, and this is a piece of non-fiction about the state of the gender health gap, particularly in the UK. I really enjoyed this book. I've read quite a lot of books about gender and pain. Pain and Prejudice is one, Unwell Women is another one, but I think this one is my favourite. I'm going to say Sarah instead of Graham because she is my friend. So Sarah interviewed a lot of different people while she was writing this. She interviews physicians and researchers, and she covers a wide range of topics, not just things like childbirth and sexual health and menopause, although she does cover all of those things in detail, but also other illnesses and diseases that predominantly affect women and people of minority genders, and the lack of research. And she goes really into detail about systemic reasons for this, and the lack of money and the lack of interest in bodies perceived to be women. And she also does a really good job of being trans inclusive, which is something that I have found is not common. I feel like a lot of the books will give a few throwaway sentences to say "and also trans women," whereas Sarah integrates it into every single section of the topic, talking about non-binary people, trans women and trans men as well. So she does integrate everything, and as I said, it is interviews, so it is not all just Sarah's perspective or research that she's done in reading. It is interviews with lots of different people, all stacked up, and I think it offers pretty much the broadest overview, I would say, of this topic of anything that I've ever read, and it's also very well written, very cohesive, and very compelling. So I definitely think worth your read. I also read Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver this year, and I have been raving about it ever since. This is the story of David Copperfield retold and set in the 90s and noughties in Appalachia, but I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly where in Appalachia. It is told in first person, as David Copperfield is, in the voice of Demon Copperhead, who is a young boy who is the son of a drug-addicted mother, and he doesn't know his father dies before he is born. And we follow him through his life from childhood up fully growing up, the experiences that he has being involved in the foster care system and with addiction and abuse, and it is a very dark book in some ways, but it is also a book filled with a lot of love between our main character and a lot of the other people he meets. There are moments of lightness and a lot of humour as well. In that kind of Dickensian way, there are characters who are representative of a certain idea, who are also kind of caricatures and kind of amusing at the same time. It is a very long book, but I think that it really works because it fully explores Demon's experience and his mentality, his experience going through all of this, and his changing from being this very upbeat little boy through the anger that he experiences and the despair as well. And I think it is really well done. The best thing about this book is the voice. It is so brilliantly written. Barbara Kingsolver is from Appalachia, and she uses the voice and the dialect of the place to bring to life this character. As I said, it is written in first person, and his turn of phrase is so wonderfully beautiful and also evocative of the time period. I listened to the audiobook, which I think was definitely a good idea, because obviously I'm not from the US, let alone Appalachia, so it is not my sound, my native way of talking, so I'm very glad that I think the audiobook actor really helped bring it to life. He was a really wonderful voice to do it, and I think the voice of this is what really made me fall in love, and I'm so glad it won the Women's Prize. And then the final book on my list, the potentially best book I've read of the year so far, is On Beauty by Zadie Smith. I do also have a vlog reading that because I read it as well at the same time as I was reading Howard's End, which is the book on which it is based. That's interesting. I hadn't considered that. My top 2 books of the year so far are modern day retellings of Victorian novels, but I really enjoyed On Beauty. It is much less of a direct take on Howard's End than Damon Copperhead is on David Copperfield. It tells the story of the Belsey family and the Kipps family, but mostly we're focused on the Belseys. We have the father Howard, who is an art critic, the mother Kiki, nurse practitioner, and their 3 children. They have lived in London, but they have moved back to America to work in the Northeast. Kiki is from America, although she is from Florida, and they're working in a loosely camouflaged Harvard University. At the start of the novel, the oldest son goes to work for Monty Kipps, who is his father's biggest rival. Writes an email saying that he has got himself engaged, which is again how Howard's end begins. And we just follow the lives of the Belsey family, their interactions with the Kippses, who are their opposites. Whereas they are kind of the liberal elite, the Kippses are also obviously elite, but they are much more conservative and Christian, and Monty Kipps is very traditional and from Trinidad, I believe. It is a character study, it is a comedy of manners, it is a satirical takedown of the ivory towers of the Ivy League. And it pokes fun at each and every one of our characters. Whilst they are terribly flawed and whilst they do terrible things, they are also very lovable. They feel so fleshed out that you feel very close to them, and they are very forgivable in their transgressions. There are so many different interactions. There is the consideration of being mixed race in America, and the Levi, for example, the youngest son, is looking for an authentic Black American experience that he feels he is outside of. Being mixed race, London born, and from this kind of elite middle class family in this very big fancy house in a fancy neighbourhood. There are also battles over things like affirmative action within the schools and various bad behaviours that have happened before the start of the novel, but it is, I think, the characters themselves and also Zadie Smith's impeccable writing and her humour that comes through. As soon as I first read the first few pages of this book, I knew it was going to be one that I loved because I felt myself so settled into the writing. Ooh, I think I've talked about those books for far longer than I intended to, but they are the 10 books that I consider my favourites of the year so far. We'll see how many make it to my top 10 of the year at the end of the year. I'm definitely having a better reading year this year than I did last year. I have a lot more books that I'm excited about and that I want to talk to you about. Please let me know what your favourites of the year are so far in the comments down below. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. I put out new videos twice a week, so I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye!